What is a Yorkshire pudding? I have read about Yorkshire puddings in literature of the 19th century. Sounds interesting, but I've never eaten a Yorkshire pudding, at least not a true one that I know of. Now, I've done some research here and I really want to try one. It turns out to be a super simple recipe, at least putting the ingredients together, but cooking it? Now that's going to be a challenge. If we research Yorkshire pudding, at least as much time as I've been able to put into it, apparently Hannah Glasse in 1747 is the first person to really kind of talk about a Yorkshire pudding, and she gives us a recipe. Now, she isn't inventing this recipe, but she may have invented the name of the recipe, because we find a very, very similar recipe slightly earlier in 1737, about 10 years earlier. This recipe is ultra simple. We're making a very simple batter, classic sort of like an English pancake batter. We've got eggs, we've got milk, we've got flour, we've got some ginger, a little bit of salt. That's about it. And like puddings of the 18th century, we can either boil it or we can bake it. But we're not really doing either one of those. With a Yorkshire pudding, we're actually sort of baking it right beside the fire, not in an oven, and we're baking it under a piece of meat that's putting its drippings into it. So we're flavoring it. We're giving it a massive savory flavor. At least hopefully that's what we're trying to aim for. So why does Hannah Glasse call it a Yorkshire pudding? Really good question. And of course, we don't have the perfect answer for it. I can come up with a couple of ideas. I think that a lot of Hannah Glasse's cookery was city cookery. It's a London cookery. And she saw this recipe as something that was maybe more primitive, more simplistic. It had some special things going on around it. Maybe it was a humble kind of a dish. And so she thought, kind of a marketing thing. What can I call this? How can I call this like a country pudding? And so she thought, Yorkshire. I will give it the title Yorkshire because that's kind of the feeling that Yorkshire had in the time period. That it was rural, that it was humble in its economic situation, that it had a special language to itself, or at least a dialect. Everyone from Yorkshire has a special way of speaking, and so she thought, I will attach this Yorkshire name to it. Now, did she know that it had particular connections to Yorkshire? I don't know for sure. I think she's just titling it like that. There's also the question of why this pudding and its humbleness. And it's likely that this dish is made to fill you up before you get to the meat dish. So basically we're stretching the important part of the expensive part of a meal by giving you this very filling kind of pudding before we're giving you the roasted meat. Imagine you're going to supper someplace, you're gonna visit someone, and they bring you this strange, like fluffy pancake thing that's baked in meat drippings, and maybe that's all you've got. That is the meal. Maybe they're saving the meat that they cooked it under for the next day. We don't know exactly how this is being used, but it's likely a fairly humble dish, although if it's in Hannah Glasse's cookbook, it might show up on the rich table too. Now, before we get into the recipe, I've already started a big roasting fire over here, and I've got my meat already starting to cook. Now, this is a nice big cut of beef. That's what most of these recipes talk about, either beef or mutton, and they're roasting it, and it should be a fatty piece of meat because we need lots of drippings. The whole point of this is that we have fats and cooking and being this wonderful rich flavor, but we don't want to lose it. So on all these fires, you see the meat hanging up and the fire beside it so that we can catch all those drippings. We can either baste it, or in this case, we're using those drippings and we are putting them right into the pudding while it's cooking. Now, while Hannah Glasse does the first recipe and all the other ones are based upon it, it is very convoluted and hard to understand. So we're gonna skip ahead 30 years and we're gonna read Charlotte Mason's version, and she's gonna help us out a lot. So here's Charlotte Mason's version of a Yorkshire pudding baked under meat. A quart of milk, 3 eggs, a little salt, some grated ginger, Flour enough to make it as a batter pudding. Put it into small tin dripping pan of a size for the purpose, whatever that is. Put it under beef, mutton, or veal while roasting. When brown, cut it into 4 or 5 lengths. Turn it that it may brown on the other side. Now, if you go looking at modern Yorkshire pudding recipes, they are not like this at all. Most modern Yorkshire pudding recipes are baked in the oven, so we're not baking it under the meat, and we aren't disturbing it. So in this one, we're actually flipping it over like a pancake, basically. It's like a pancake that's fitting this entire vessel, right? You might call it a Dutch baby or a German pancake, right? That you would bake in the oven. But in this case, we're baking it beside the fire, baking it under the drippings, and we are slicing it up so we can flip it over and cook it on the bottom side. So we've got our meat already going and the drippings are starting in the pan and the pan is heating up. Now we can make our batter, and the batter again is extremely simple. We've got a mixture of flour and milk and eggs. Most of the recipes that we have to work with are not careful with the quantity of ingredients, and that can really make a big difference in a batter like this. So we're going to adjust these a little bit. I believe that most of them are making the batter and they're probably asking for too much flour. So we'll see something like use a quart of milk, use 3 or 4 eggs, maybe 5 eggs, and then add the flour until you get to a certain consistency. We need that to be a very thin consistency. They're saying pancake consistency, but their pancakes were very thin. They were a lot more like crepes. So we don't want this to be too thick. If we make it too thick, then our Yorkshire pudding will be very dense, and we want it to be kind of light and fluffy. Let's go ahead and start off with the eggs. We're gonna take 4 eggs and we're gonna whisk them well. I'm gonna add just a little bit of salt at this point, and then I'm gonna pour in my pint of milk and whisk it some more. We want this very well whisked. We do have some spices in here. Depends on the recipe, but the earliest recipes don't have any spices. Then later on, they add ginger, and some of them add nutmeg. And then we're gonna take our flour and add it a little bit at a time and make a very thin batter. So truly the hard part of this recipe is the cooking process itself. We're taking our dish here and we're baking this basically in a cast iron Dutch oven because of the fact that we're right beside the fire. It can easily damage other kinds of vessels. They talk about using dripping pans. You know, we don't know exactly what they mean in some of those cases. So I'm going to use this Dutch oven. We're going to set this again beside the fire and underneath the meat. What's going to happen is it's going to bake on one side of the Dutch oven in this case. So we need to continue to rotate this so it cooks evenly. And what it'll do is it'll cook along the sides, and it might try to puff up some, and that's good. But in this case, it's just gonna kind of turn into a very dense pancake. Yes, the recipe calls for us to slice this up and flip it over. Again, you couldn't do that with a modern Yorkshire pudding. It would totally ruin the whole concept. So we know that, you know, that's what's going on in the 18th century, is that it's sort of like a pancake and we go ahead and we flip it over. So here is our Yorkshire pudding that we have dished out, and it's nice and browned up, which is good. It's not light and fluffy. It is kind of dense and maybe even sort of a little rubbery. That's all right. We're getting some good savory smells here along with ginger. I put in a good quantity of ginger because without that, it's going to be kind of tasteless. So we want to have enough salt, enough ginger in here, and enough of those meat flavors that we have something to really dig into flavor-wise. The texture is almost like a stiff custard, right? Definitely got some of that savoriness of it from the meat, and the ginger's coming through just like I could smell it. It's not sweet at all because there is no sugar in this recipe. But you could see it's very filling in how it's going to turn out. Again, you can see this as the course you serve before the meat to fill people up so that they don't need a lot of the expensive meat that you've been roasting here. And roasting it is, maybe it's kind of one of the easiest ways to cook the meat, but it is also not terribly efficient. You know, as you're roasting it, it shrinks down and you get less kind of bang for the buck. So it's an expensive way to cook meat. And you can see how this would help balance out the budget.